So I had the joyous pleasure this last weekend of spending the whole weekend at SeaWorld. Well, all day Sunday anyway, from early in the morning from the time the park opened until the rain started in the evening, almost 7 o'clock at night. But part of that joy was the fact that I was there with all 4 of my kids who are now pretty much grown. The baby's 17, the oldest is 28, and all of the kids, save one, of their children. So there were 4 between the ages of 3 and 9. And when we would move like a herd, because we had 7 adults and 4 kids. So everywhere we went, we were quite the herd to get from one place to another. From time to time, I would look down and the youngest one would be distracted by something that was going by or watching somebody else, or just feeling that presence next to his shoulder would think the person he was walking next to is who he was supposed to be walking next to. And there were a couple of times I would look down and he was starting to veer off a little bit because he wasn't watching closely to who he was supposed to be holding hands with. So we would all grab fingers or we would all hold hands, and from time to time we'd realize moving as a herd was a very slow process. So I would pick him up and put him on my shoulders, or one of my teenage sons would, so that he would be able to move as fast as everybody else because his legs are short. As we moved through that process, I realized that every place we wanted to go, the calculation of journey time had to take into account everybody in the herd in order to get from point A to point B. And there were some times that getting from point A to point B required a rush or a run or a sprint, and we would send someone on ahead. And we would send a teenage boy, or we would send one of the girls, and they would go and reserve seats and wait for everybody else. Sometimes, though, we get invited along on a journey with God. And in that journey with God, we feel like the ones with the little short legs. We look up and we feel like God has run on way ahead of us. Or sometimes it's exactly the opposite. God says, go to this place. And we start our journey to that place, and we get somewhere and we look around and we're like, God, are you keeping up? Because I haven't seen you in this in a minute. I don't know where you're at. I don't know what you're up to. There are leaders throughout the Bible who have had exactly that same challenge. And there are leaders throughout that Bible who sometimes get distracted and they wander a little bit off the path, but God always calls them back. And there are leaders in the Bible who, when God called them to do something, they were already a little long in the tooth. It weren't that their legs were too short. It was that their life had been really long. They were a little older. They were a little slower. They moved a little differently because so much life had passed them by. Do you know that when Abraham, then known as Abram, was called to go into the promised land, to begin to take the promised land, you know, he was 75 years old when God invited him to start that journey? Think about that for a minute. How many of us have had a midlife crisis, and in our 30s or 40s we look back and go, I've accomplished nothing by now. I should have been rich and wealthy and sitting on my stool by now. And instead we're looking at our life going, I still have so much more to do. I have so many more things I want to do for myself, for my family, for my God, for the legacy to leave to my children and my children's children. And I got nothing. I got nothing. I haven't accomplished what I want to accomplish at this point. There's so much more ahead of me. Abraham was 75 and still had his original name. God hadn't changed his name to Abraham. It was still Abram. His wife was still Sarai. They hadn't had any children yet. But I want you to listen a little bit to this journey in Genesis chapter 12. It says, God told Abram, leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land that I will show you. Now, here's something interesting. At 75, he still shared a home with his father, or at least close enough proximity to his father that God had to tell him, leave your family and your father at 75. Think about our culture today where we basically kick our kids out at 18 years old and say, hey, good luck, go make it on your own. I know there's a lot to be said for the independence of teens, and one of the biggest challenges, at least in Western culture today, is what we call boomerang kids, and that is that we send them out on their own, they go out and do their first couple of years of college, or maybe even give it their first undergrad degree, and then realize the job market is brutal, and so they've got $100,000 worth of student loan debt and no job, and they're back home with mom and dad trying to make ends meet just to get enough of a job to pay back their student loan debt, much less a car payment and a house payment and insurance and medical bills and children and food and blah, blah, blah. Abram was 75 when God said, leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation and bless you. I'll make you famous. I'll make you a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I'll curse, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left, just as God said, and Lot left with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and the nephew Lot with him, along with the possessions and the people they had gotten in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan and arrived safely. I love the way God jumps forward in that portion of the story and says, they left here and then they arrived safely. And instantly you think, oh, well, that was a quick journey. But the rest of the chapter goes a little more in detail of the point A to point B. I've been reading the book Divine Detours, and he talks about how we often see our starting point and we see our ending point through a dream or a divine vision. And we assume that, like geometry says, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. But we forget that God likes to take us through paths like this to get from A to B. That divine detours sometimes look like calamity to us. They look like disaster. They look like something has gone wrong. And Abram experienced exactly that. It says, Abram passed through the country as far as Shechem and Gomorrah. And at the time, the Canaanites occupied the land. So they had to go right through the land of their enemy. God appeared to Abram and said, I'll give this land to your children. So Abraham built an altar. Abraham built an altar at the place God appeared to him. He moved on from there to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent between Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. He built an altar there and he prayed to God. Abram kept moving, steadily making his way south to the Negev. But then a famine came. Abram went down to Egypt to live. When there's a famine, kind of like when there's a natural disaster, people tend to flock to major cities. When I was in the Congo, Kinshasa is a result of that. Now a city of 12 million people in a footprint the size of Dallas, Texas. But the reason they're all there is because the wars and the battles that were happening to the east caused them all to be driven to the west and into the city. There's safety in numbers, there's food, there's supply, the supply routes are short. When there's a war, it's really hard to get a food truck from one place to another. They get attacked, they get ambushed. And so by moving into the city, by coming to the place of the major congregations, there's a lot of safety and there's food and there's a lot to be said there. So when there was a famine in the land, even the place that Abram had settled between Bethel and Ai, he built his altar there and then he kept moving to the Negev. But on his way to the Negev, there was a famine. So he detoured, divine detour. He goes into Egypt. It says Abram went down to Egypt to live, and it was a hard famine. As he drew near to Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "Look, we both know you're a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they're going to think, aha, that's his wife, and they're going to kill me, and then they'll let you live. So do me a favor. Tell them that you're my sister. Because of you, they'll welcome me and let me live." Now, I think that's probably the first time that a man called by God was intentionally and knowingly deceptive in advance. This would be a premeditated act, according to the laws of our country today. A premeditated act to do what he knew was not true. When Abram arrived in Egypt, the Egyptians took one look and saw his wife was stunningly beautiful. Pharaoh's princes raved over her to Pharaoh, and she was taken to live with Pharaoh. Now, it would be hard enough for me to think of the idea that I would be killed because my wife is beautiful and they just want to take her. But the idea that I get to live and they're going to take her anyway, I'm not sure I'm okay with that either. Is it worse to live knowing they took your wife or to die knowing you're going to take your wife? I don't know which is better. Because of her, Abraham got along very well. Okay, hang on a minute. So because he lied and the Pharaoh took his wife, who he thought was his sister, he got along pretty well. So basically they bought his wife from him. It says he accumulated sheep and cattle and male and female donkeys and men and women servants and camels. So he got paid off pretty good for his wife. His sister. His wife. Yeah. But God. But God hit Pharaoh hard because of Abram's wife Sarai, and everybody in the palace got seriously sick. Pharaoh called for Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me she's your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so I'd take her as my wife? Here's your wife back. Take her and get out." Pharaoh ordered his men to get Abram out of the country, and they sent him and his wife and everything he owned on the way. Now, I'm not going to suggest for 1 minute that you should, by deceit, by hook and crook, that you should lie to get ahead. But I can tell you that when Abram realized there was a famine in the land and the sustenance that he had, the material possessions he had, wasn't going to be enough to get him through that. He went into Egypt as a divine detour, off the path that God had called him to, away from the place God had called him as a destination. He went into Egypt to be able to survive the famine. While there, he had to lie about his wife in order to preserve his own life. For the sake of his life, he lied, handed his wife over to Pharaoh, and as a result became a very wealthy man. Then Pharaoh realized, hey, I've done the wrong thing here, and gave his wife back and let him keep all this stuff and kicked him out of the country. He didn't imprison him. He didn't kill him. He threw him out of the country. Why? Because God stepped in and said, I'm going to bring a plague on you. You're going to pay the price for taking this man's wife. And Pharaoh knew better than to mess with God. Some of us don't have that much sense. I'm just going to read the opening couple of lines of chapter 13. It says, "So Abram left Egypt and went back to the Negev, he and his wife and everything he owned, and Lot still with him. And by now, Abram was a very rich man, loaded with cattle and with silver and gold." The point that I want to make in leadership, when we talk about someone like Abram, is the fact that Abram was moved by divine destiny because he received a divine call. God called him and said, "Abram, I got something to do. I need you to leave your home, leave your family, leave your father's house, take everything you own, and skedaddle. Get out of here. Go someplace else." And he packed up everything he had and one nephew. And they took off on a journey. And I can only imagine with Abraham and Sarai and Lot and his wife and their children. Abram didn't have any yet. And all the manservants and all the maidservants and all the donkeys and the cows and the sheep and the goats, because they took everything. And there was no big truck to come and load it all up in and move it for them. They took everything with them. Like our herd moving through SeaWorld with 11 of us at different ages and different paces and different speeds and different styles, and some with little short legs. They had to move that entire herd across the land possessed by the Canaanites. They went right through Ai and Bethel. They went right through Shechem and Okomorah. And as they journeyed through there, they had to make that little detour because of the famine into Egypt and then on to the Negev. But they were empowered by a call from God to do that. I remember hearing many years ago, it's been close to 25 years ago, I heard a guy, and I believe it was on a cassette tape at the time, I heard him say, "Where God guides, God provides." And I thought, that's kind of an obnoxious statement. God doesn't owe me to do this thing. If it's my idea, if it's my notion, God doesn't owe me anything for that. But then I've read since then stories like this, where God made a way not only for Abram and his entire flock of family to make it from the land of his father to the promised land, but he also provided along the way a lot of accumulated wealth. That's a pretty powerful statement when you look back at how God moves us today. Do we as leaders surrender ourselves to the divine call to be energized, to be put in the pathway of profit, to be put in the pathway of successful business? Or do we as leaders step back and go, I've got my own plan, I've got my own way of doing this, I think I can figure this out. I don't need God to energize me to move that way. I don't need God to provide for me. I can do this on my own. We run ahead of God because he tells us where that destiny is. We run ahead and then we look back and go, God, are you keeping up? If you're a leader at any level, leading your home, leading your family, leading a business, leading a military troop, leading a country, there's going to be a time and a place where you're going to need to stop where you are and build an altar. And I want to ask you this question. If you were to stop right now and build that altar, would you know that you're where you're supposed to be with God? Are you in the place God told you to be? Are you at least on the pathway? Or have you taken upon your own selfish ambition the drive to reach that destiny all on your own? as you think about those things today, I want you to go back and read Genesis chapter 12 again. I want you to pull out your maps, and I want you to look and find, where are these places, Shechem and the Oak of Moreh? Where is Bethel and the Ai? Where are they in relationship to Egypt and the Negev? And as you see those things on a geographic map, I want you to kind of draw that line with an overlay or a pencil and realize just what kind of journey God had Abram on. Before he had his first child, he said, I will bless this land. You will be the father of many nations. And I'm only getting started. And he was 75. Grab your Bible today, jump into Genesis chapter 12, spend some time studying Abram, and see where your leadership skills line up with his and the kind of decisions that you need to make. I'm J Loren Norris, and you've been watching Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.